Hi everyone! Welcome to ArtStoryLab. My name is Hejin. In this episode, we're traveling to the Caribbean. No, not to the islands of swanky tourist resorts of today, but to the region when it was known as the West Indies, more than 200 years ago, when these islands were colonies of various European powers. We're focusing specifically on the small islands of Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago, which were handed over from France to Britain in 1763 at the end of the Seven Years' War. Since the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 in the island of Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, the Spanish and the Portuguese dominated the colonization of these islands in the 1500s. Then, beginning in the 1600s, France, England, the Netherlands, and Denmark joined the race to increase their foothold in the so-called New World. With disease, wars, slavery, and genocide, Europeans pretty much decimated the diverse indigenous populations of these islands, including the Tainos in the Greater Antilles, and the island Caribs and other smaller groups in the Lesser Antilles. And they established plantations to plunder the rich natural resources that the new island colonies had to offer. Among various cash crops cultivated in these islands, including coffee, rice, and indigo, sugar was the undisputed star. Beginning in the 17th century, the production of sugar in the island colonies of the West Indies awakened an enormous appetite for sugar in Europe and North American colonies. Sugar entered the everyday life of British consumers as necessary accompaniment to the newly introduced and widely popular coffee, tea, and chocolate, and as rum. Sugar from the Caribbean colonies brought tremendous wealth to Britain and France. And having driven out the indigenous population with disease and genocide, Europeans displaced millions of Africans across the Middle Passage and subjugated them to chattel slavery in the Caribbean sugar plantations to do the back-breaking work of cultivating and refining sugar. As with other European colonizers, the British rationalized their practice of slavery and exploitation in the Caribbean through cultural productions such as this image, which served as a frontispiece to the Universal Dictionary of Trade and Commerce published in 1774 in London. In this allegorical scene, we see Britannia, the female personification of Britain, seated near a port and holding a trident, symbolizing the nation's maritime prowess. Riches from far corners of the world have come in as ship cargo and are displayed at Britannia's feet. Next to her are personifications of the four continents, Europe, Asia, America, and Africa, willingly offering exotic gifts to the boastful Britannia. Notice here how America with her feather headdress and Africa with her elephant trunk headgear are baring their breasts, in contrast to fully clothed Europe and Asia, signifying their presumed lack of quote-unquote civilization. America offers Britannia sugarcane and tobacco leaves. Africa gifts an elephant tusk while kneeling, indicating the supposedly natural subservience of Africans and obliquely justifying the British practice of slavery. Pictured in this way, Britain positions itself as simply taking what was given to it willingly and plentifully by the four continents. And the poem inscribed below the image states, "On trade alone thy glory stands, that benefit is unconfined. Be commerce then thy sole design, keep that and all the world is thine." Profits from the colonies is a path to power for the British Empire, and the extraction of resources, both natural and human, was central to the British colonial efforts in the West Indies and elsewhere around the globe. By the middle decades of the 1700s, the so-called ceded islands were home to around 70,000 enslaved Africans. They produced about a fifth of the total supply of sugar in the British Empire. Plantation economy drastically changed the demographic of these islands. In addition to the surviving indigenous Caribs, Africans, Afro-Creoles, meaning people of African descent raised in the West Indies, and mixed-race people populated the ceded islands, along with white European planters forming a very small minority. This racial diversity in the colonial Caribbean led to the modern notion of race, which we explored in a previous episode on Jean Baptiste du Tertre's Portrait of a Black Woman. It was in the later decades of the 18th century that the idea and practice of dividing the humankind according to skin color began to take root. And given the African and Afro-Creole majority in the West Indies, drawing a clear boundary around whiteness and other racial types was crucial for British settlers to maintain colonial order and justification. You may be asking, why weren't there a lot of British settlers living there? That's because many owners of Caribbean plantations were actually stationed in the British metropole. The white Britons who were in the islands wanted to make their money fast and return home as quickly as possible. That meant that there were a lot of absentee planters who wanted to see pictures of their Caribbean lands, but not necessarily of the enslaved Africans who were doing the actual work of generating profit in their plantations. Enter Agostino Brunias, an Italian artist who worked in England for a time, who was hired by the British colonial administrator in charge of promoting and overseeing the sale of land in the Caribbean. When Brunias arrived in the West Indies around 1765, his job was first to paint pictures of absentee planters' lands to send them back to Britain, and second, to promote the capitalist imperial project by soliciting more land purchase and enticing the British to settle in the islands. Brunias produced paintings and engravings depicting social life of the diverse population of the British West Indies. Brunias never depicted enslaved people working or being treated badly by slave drivers. Instead, he represented enslaved and free people of color and island Caribs trading in bustling Sunday markets, dancing, conversing, and strolling in the streets. According to the art historian Kriz Dian, this near-total absence of any reference to the abject conditions of slavery and the grueling work of enslaved Africans in Brunias' work was because the people he was working for, the wealthy British planters, wanted to see the West Indies as a space that was becoming refined, and didn't want to see pictures that implicated them in slavery and its attendant crimes. In other words, denying any visible sign of human bondage was integral to the British colonists' self-image as a civilizing influence on colonial society. Indeed, in European representations of the colonial Caribbean, visual references to slavery and slave trade are pretty much absent. Instead of the plantations as sites of forced labor, they present the West Indies as tropical paradise where bounties of nature are readily available to its inhabitants. See, for example, this engraving made after the landscape painter George Robertson's View in the Island of Jamaica from 1778. In this dramatically lit, verdant landscape with lush tropical vegetation, an African man casually drives cattle across the river. In the foreground, a mixed-race woman carrying a basket of produce offers food to a black man in the pose similar to that of the kneeling slave in the Wedgwood anti-slavery medallion, which we discussed in the previous episode. In the island of Jamaica, life is easy, food abundant, and its people good. The woman of mixed race with her tawny skin color is charity in the flesh, generously sharing the island's bounty with the kneeling enslaved man. The image implicitly attributes her social and moral superiority to her partially European ancestry suggested by her cinnamon-colored skin, in contrast to the dark-skinned African man who benefits from her generosity. While visually absent, the owner of this piece of land, William Beckford, to whom the inscription dedicates this engraving, is an invisible force that orders this idyllic landscape, the supposedly benevolent planter who is responsible for caring for this land and the good people who live on it. Moreover, according to the art historian Mia Bagneris, images like this one also represent Africans as people who have been living there for a really long time, naturalizing their presence in the Caribbean and erasing the painful history of and reason for their forced displacement. In contrast to Robertson's idealized Jamaica, Brunias's pictures of the ceded islands focus on the vibrant social life of the people. They show enslaved and free people of color in their own worlds, enjoying leisure activities such as dancing and cudgeling, with little or no white presence. For instance, Linden Market shows a busy Sunday market where people socialize and trade various goods. From the central vignette of two mixed-race women at the stall with bolts of cotton fabric run by African women, we see another mixed-race woman with children at her stand, island Carib men and women on the left corner, and a produce stand at the right foreground. Various figures mingle in the middle ground, and a cudgeling match takes place between two men in the background. At Sunday markets, enslaved people bought and sold the produce from their small plots of land where they could grow their own food and livestock. With money from selling their goods at Sunday markets, they could purchase their necessities and little luxuries, and even buy their own freedom, practicing entrepreneurial skills and forging their own communities. Dancing was another major theme in Brunias' depictions of Afro-Caribbean culture. In this engraving made after Brunias' painting, we see a beautifully dressed African or Afro-Creole couple dancing to the beat of a drum and a timbrel, while a lighter-skinned mixed-race woman is being wooed by a man. In the right foreground, an African woman lays out plates of fruit from a picnic basket, while another feast is taking place among women of color in the background. Images such as this, highlighting exuberant celebrations among Afro-Caribbeans, fabricate what the scholar Jean Bagneris calls the myth of the merry and contented slaves, certainly appealing to the British planters' colonial fiction that slavery is good for these folks because look how happy, healthy, and well-dressed they are. They all have this free time to dance and have fun. Convenient, isn't it? In addition to this pernicious and totally self-serving delusion, the art historian Sarah Thomas connects these images of happy, thriving Afro-Caribbeans to the new attitude towards the treatment of enslaved people that was emerging in Britain in the 1770s. To put an end to the Atlantic slave trade, British thinkers proposed a series of social reforms to improve the quality of life for those who were already enslaved in the West Indies. The argument was that by making their living conditions better, the enslaved people would reproduce more, and the British would no longer have to rely on slave trade. This proposition was supported not only by planters predictably, but also by abolitionists. The author of the book in which this print was included described this idea in these words. Most of these gentlemen, without doubt, consider this measure of improving slaves' condition as only the first process in a more extended and liberal plan, which has for its object, by stopping the further influx of Negroes into our islands, to compel the planters to cherish and husband their present stock, and sustain it in future by natural increase, until by milder treatment and the Christian institutes, the manners of the slaves shall become softened, their vices corrected, and their dispositions gradually prepare for a total emancipation from that absolute slavery in which they are now held. In other words, through improved treatment by planters and Christianity, enslaved people will become civilized, and with that they will then achieve their freedom. The idea that enslaved people should be treated better is not because they were thought to be human equals to planters and abolitionists, as suggested by the language referring to the enslaved as livestock. They should be treated better because to do so was in the interest of the British imperial project, and because they were seen to lack the virtues and civility, and thus do not deserve their freedom yet. Okay, this is a lot. This extraordinary European colonial mental gymnastics leaves me breathless. Let's all take a deep breath. Now back to Brunias. The art historian Sarah Thomas sees many visual cues to this argument throughout Brunias' dancing scenes. The flirtatious movement and gaze between the dancing couple, the swollen belly of the female dancer, the breadfruit tree bearing large ripe fruit, the presence of children, and the large women-to-men ratio among the black figures in these scenes hint at this reform of improving enslaved people's lives for imperialist gains. But so far, I've explained only what these pictures could have meant for the people that Brunias worked for, the British colonists. Can these images mean something different to other people? Is there a way for us, the modern viewers of the 21st century, to reclaim these images as something other than tools for imperialist agenda? The art historian Jean Baptiste says, yes, absolutely. She argues that these images certainly visualize the myth of the merry, contented slaves that served the British colonial interest. They also provide evidence of the totally autonomous and vibrant Afro-Caribbean culture built by enslaved and free people of color completely independent of white people's influence. Bagneris identifies the African elements in the dancing scene. The male dancer's pose with his arm akimbo with one leg raised and turned is an aggressive stance from the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa that was brought over to the New World. The couple is probably dancing the chica, the type of dance popular throughout the Caribbean among people of color, also known as bambula. The clapping, beating of the drums, and tapping the timbrel were all central to the music played at African gatherings in the Caribbean. The costume of the women with the white full skirts gathered just below their bottoms with handkerchiefs to accentuate their behinds are reminiscent of African clothing. Bagneris explains that this powerful black community and its autonomous culture fully on display in Brunias' pictures were the very ingredients for potential resistance to slavery and colonial oppression. Indeed, European colonizers recognized the subversive potential of the African drumbeat when they routinely banded throughout North America and the West Indies, fearful that their powerful rhythm might incite the enslaved to rebel against the planters. Agostino Brunias' paintings and engravings of the Afro-Caribbean life in the colonial West Indies are unique in that they sustain one set of meanings for his patrons, the British planter class of the 18th century, and another for us modern viewers. Although Brunias certainly could not have explicitly communicated the subversive potential of Black autonomy and resistance in his time, his images teach us that the meanings that pictures carry cannot be completely controlled by one dominant group of people. Different viewers bring different expectations to interacting with artworks, and the power to find new alternative meanings is in the inquisitive mind of the beholder. That's it for this episode. As always, share your thoughts and questions in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Art Story Lab.